Hello, this is Paul Giamatti speaking.
And I'm Stephen Asma speaking.
Also speaking.
Speaking.
Currently in the act of speaking. And this is the Chinwag. Welcome back.
Yeah, good to see you, my man.
Yes, nice to see you, sir. A little while back there, we had a dandy conversation with this gentleman, Alex Edelman.
Yeah, he is a talent in every way. Smart,
Indeed.
Very funny,
Yes.
Clever guy.
Absolutely.
Well read.
Very well read. Very wise guy in every ways. A wise guy in the best sense of the term. He is most recently, had an award-winning show called Alex Edelman Just for Us that just finished a run on Broadway and is streaming now on HBO Max, so catch that.
It's very good.
Yes, it's excellent. We promised another episode with him, a continuation, the second act of our conversation with him, and here it is.
I have a way to actually transition this conversation to baseball.
Oh, sure.
Okay, well, watch. This is the thing that really intrigues me about baseball is that there's the rules and there's the practice and there's the sort of rigor of the sport, but then you're trying to catch those authentic moments that are like spontaneous and that's why I think a lot of like you get in the zone. And the same is true in religion, the same is true in baseball. And it's why I like baseball players are so superstitious because they do all this crazy superstitious ritual in order to get there, in order to, like, they're trying to not try. They're trying to have this kind of spontaneity. And I was just wondering, like, you've done a lot of work in baseball and do you like, have you seen crazy superstitions? I know this guy, like,
the most.
Turk somebody, he would like wash his hands between every inning. He would make symbols in the pitcher's mound in between every innings, all this stuff.
That just sounds like a crazy person. That just sounds like a nut
A
job.
lot of baseball players do that shit.
Well, there was a great baseball player who was one of my favorites when I was a kid named Mark Fidrych.
Of course, the bird. The bird Fidrych?
The bird Fidrych was a pitcher for the Tigers.
31. Did he win 31 games in 1983? Yeah.
Oh, nice.
He really might have been a little bit earlier than that, but I
Sure,
can't.
that makes sense.
But it was but he was great for a season, and then he blew his arm out. Basically, is kind of what happened to him. But he famously would talk to the ball. He would sit. He did these crazy sort of eccentric things, and he talked to the ball, and he would do all this stuff, and he had to go shake people's hands after a play and stuff. And
In a certain order.
It was. It was very kind of wacky, and he was beloved because of this crazy. And he looked like Big Bird. He was like this big guy with this kind of crazy head of hair, and he came to an unfortunate sad end. But he blew his arm out, and so he really only lasted the season.
Did he have a sidearm pitch? Was he one of these sidewinder guys or no?
Yeah, man, he had eccentric. His style was eccentric, I think.
He was very he was really like, God, I remember that he passed away, but he won.
It's horrible how he died, but yes.
He won the Cy Young. It might have been 76 or something like that, but it was one of the years the Tigers dominated.
That sounds more right.
And but yeah, these guys, when I was working at the Red Sox, there was this, I remember a player had a specific ritual. He had heard that Vladimir Guerrero, if you'll excuse the crudeness here, pissed on his feet to make them hard.
Really?
And so, yes. Which, by the way,
We need to try this.
Please someone fact check this. But
Wow,
I don't want to cast aspersion.
Not on the Chinwag.
I tell you, it hasn't made my feet hard. I mean, I do it all the time. That's what it'll like calcify in your feet. The uric acid will like concentrate in your
something like that. Baseball players have really weird. Ichiro used to massage his feet. He would really like beat it up. He'd beat his feet up and thought that the bottoms of his feet were what really made. And so there was a ball player on the Red Sox who I think was, or by the way, maybe it was his hands, but it was something like Vlad was pissing on something. And some part of his body, and there was a player who had not quite interpreted it correctly, and was just being hollow, and but he was having a good year. And I remember someone on the Red Sox just went, "Whatever works, man. You know, like whatever,
right?
Whatever works."
Sure.
But it was really weird, the superstitions of all players.
This is an interesting thing about baseball players in particular. There's a wonderful thing. I mean, one of the things I love about baseball, I'm not knowledgeable. I don't follow it all the time. I'm not super knowledgeable about it, but I find the thing itself, the phenomenon of baseball itself, really interesting. It's a cultural thing, historically, all this stuff as a kind of, like you say, as an access to another world too. It's a fascinating thing. But I've always found it interesting that, as opposed to any other sport, where I'm sure there are sort of eccentric guys in football, in hockey. I mean, there are. But for some reason, it's a tradition to have eccentric baseball players. That eccentricity is a kind of part of the game in a weird, interesting way. And I always wonder why. Why do we have these kind of Bill Lee and these kind of, Doc Ellis and these kind of nutball, but just weirdos, Ty Cobb and all these eccentrics? And what is it about it why is it a sport that seems to foster eccentricity or celebrate eccentricity? I've always wondered why, because it doesn't in other sports. Because you don't have the same thing with football players. You don't have the same thing. What is it about baseball that, to my mind, seems to be eccentric in some way, or the guys are eccentric?
I think because there's so much, baseball is weird because it's such a piecemeal sport, right? Like and the things that I love about baseball are sort of like, it's a combination, like in terms of, I TA'd a class in college called Baseball is a Road to God, which is perfect for a guy who used to work in, John Sexton, who was the president of NYU, taught this class. And
Amazing.
I TA'd it. It was fantastic. And I think baseball, more than anything else, demands a mixture of looseness and precision, right? So like you need to be loose and you need to be able to go up and like Ichiro, just to use Ichiro as an example, Ichiro was like sort of a fun guy who came over from Japan, but like he was extremely precise and calm in his movements and always and was very consistent. I think 20 at-bats into his career, he hit the 300 mark for batting average and never dipped below it for the rest of his career. That consistency is remarkable. And like, Paul, you're citing like a lot of those guys like Bill Lee and Mark Fidrych and gosh, I'm trying to think of others, but these Oil Can Boyd.
Yeah, or like, do you remember this guy, Super Joe Charbonneau, who was an outfielder for the Indians?
Of course, Super Joe Charbonneau.
But he was famously bizarre. He was famously a weird guy, doing these weird things.
They never lasted. Like, very few of those guys are in the Hall of Fame.
That's interesting.
Because you can vibrate at that frequency for a little while.
That's interesting.
If you look at, but by the way,
you can't maintain.
That's interesting. That's a very good point.
But think of Ted Williams, though, because Ted Williams is Ted Williams is a fucking maniac. Like, part of my life. But Ted Williams is like...
Oh, please, we encourage it.
There was something really, really... There's a great piece by Richard Ben Kramer called What Do You Think of Ted Williams Now?, which is about Williams in retirement in Florida marlin fishing. And
Yeah, was he a horrible, horrible guy, right?
Yeah, he was like a bad father and like a really amazing fisherman. Because he had this like really incredible temperament. But like there's something that requires a mindset that almost defies explanation. Like sometimes baseball, one of my friends is a former professional athlete for Tampa Bay Rays ball player named Fernando Perez. And actually I haven't spoken to Fernando in a bit, but once he sort of, we were talking about a David Foster Wallace essay called How Tracy Austin Broke My Heart.
Yes.
And in the piece, David Foster Wallace asks in like a pretty nice way why Tracy Austin, who was a star tennis player, had written one of the worst biographies he'd ever read in his entire life. And he said, maybe it's because the athletes maybe because it's such an unconscious act that putting it into words, being like, now I'm seeing the ball, now I'm hitting the ball, ruins it, makes it impossible. It's like a question that ruins the thing that you're asking about, like saying, is this a date? Like, as soon as you say, is this a date? The person's like, what?
That's it.
Or you're like, am I fired? Like, if you say, like, am I fired? Like, it's like, you're fired. Like, it's over. Like,
was that out of line? Was that out of line? Was I just out of line? Yeah,
it's true for artists, too. Artists are the worst. Don't ask artists to explain their work. There's a great line in Evelyn Waugh, like in Brideshead Revisited.
Really?
This guy comes to the artist and he says, let me explain your pictures to you. It's a hilarious moment.
Well,
because they're too close to it, I think.
But I'm actually sometimes astonished by some artists. I actually just happened to see this thing that was Francis Bacon and William S. Burroughs met. And it's I sent it to you, Steve. It's about a half an hour long. And the most astonishing thing is that there's somebody on the planet who could make William S. Burroughs look like a normal guy.
That's so funny.
Like, he looks like the subdued normal guy in the thing. But it is interesting. I've seen Francis Bacon. There's a lot of stuff with, for instance, Francis Bacon, or a lot of guys. I've read stuff that Mark Rothko's written and stuff like that. How fucking articulate they actually are about what they do. Now, I don't know if they're feeling that there's a demand that they say something and just they're bullshitting, but it all seems to be relevant to what they're doing. It all seems to make sense. And then I think, was it a particular era, was a particular time where there was a lot of sort of like intellectualizing about art, and there was this kind of existentialism applied to these sort of like abstract expressionists, and this idea was you were meant to be a philosopher as much as you were sort of an artist. Maybe it's that, but they are amazingly articulate about it in ways that, like, I don't know what the fuck to say about what I do. People ask me, like, I don't fucking know. I really don't. And I come up with nonsense to say because I have a hard time doing it.
I think you're too close to it.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe. But it's interesting.
Maybe too intuitive for you. Why should you have to describe what you do?
Well, that's
just
too.
do it.
Why should you? Yeah, why should you also have to do it?
But by the way, the thing for me that's interesting about baseball is never the athletes, which is so weird.
Mm-hmm.
It's like and it's so hard to explain to people because I worked in baseball. I got a job working at the Red Sox when I was 13. I wrote the kids newsletter there.
Amazing.
I was the best. It was a dream gig. I started there in 2003, which is right before they won the World Series for the first time in 86 years. I stayed through 2007 and then moved to the Dodgers and spent like a sad year at the Brewers. But like, I don't really care that much. I don't really care that much about the sort of vicissitudes of like who's winning that season or even like who's having a great year. I'm much more concerned with like the narrative of what baseball is and like what it means to Americans, which by the way, to me, it's always felt like sort of the American religion. Like talk about spirituality combined with rigorousness. Like there's a real precision to, and Paul, you know, your father's books about that were sort of the first thing that got me into it because, you know, your dad writing Baseball as Narrative and Take Time for Paradise. Where there's a quote from Take Time for Paradise that was sort of written in the office. It's like emblazoned in the entranceway where you enter the front office at Fenway Park.
Oh, cool.
And so, which is about how baseball is designed to break your heart and each season brings renewal and sort of this idea.
It's a reckoning with mortality in some ways. There's a kind of reckoning that's demanded with mortality over and over and over again.
Oh, it's such a beautiful thing.
And renewal and stuff. Yeah. Your
dad and a guy named George Grella, who wrote a book called Baseball and the American Dream, he said something about how there's no way that that humans who were playing sports ever actually thought they were playing it for the gods, or if they did, they said they were, but the idea was that they were actually imitating what they thought gods were. They were claiming some sort of small mastery over their lives.
And there you go. Yeah,
and like there is the game. Grella would say something like the game suggests godlike potential, and it reveals in form and metaphor the capabilities that you have in your life, the like spark of divinity, and how within baseball you can expand space and dissolve time, and there's something distinctly American about the yearning for this sort of eternity in terms of time and space. And
in terms of time and space. And also I think he was very, that it was a kind of, that's paradise. There's a kind of eternity of this pastoral sort of world that you can inhabit endlessly. But also I think in terms of American stuff, I think he was really into the idea of the return. I think the larger theme of returning home was a big part of it, which he saw.
Oh my God.
And you see in epic poetry, and you go back to Homer and the Odyssey and all of, and you know, the Aeneid, and it's all this sort of going back to your roots and your home. And so for the Americans, this idea of home being, this is your home, but you're coming from other places, and where's your home? And, you know, that was a big theme of it too, I think, for him, as well as this eternity thing is really cool too, and godlike eternity. Yeah, it's really cool.
I wrote a paper in college on your father's conception of home plate with 4 different conceptions pulled from Baseball as Narrative and Take Time for Paradise. And he said this thing, again, please forgive misquoting, but he said this. He asks why home plate's not called fourth base, and he also says that home is an English word that's impossible to translate into other languages because no translation gets the associations, which mixes memory and longing and a sense of security and autonomy and accessibility and inclusiveness and freedom from.
There's house and there's home, and there's the idea of home. It's a concept and not really just a word. It's a concept. Yeah. Yeah.
And also the idea that at home is the first place you realize your own originality, which is and in baseball, you have all these people, again, stealing from Bart Giamatti here, all these people, there's the batter and the catcher and the umpire, and they all have different jobs and responsibilities, and they're all gathered around home plate, or they're all gathered around this idea of home. And so and how interesting and special is that when you think about that in terms of its metaphorical possibilities, right? Like there are three people there waiting for something to happen, and they all have different jobs. And like, it's a really, I don't know, there's lots of I think it's why there's such good fiction about baseball when there's not good fiction about anything.
Interesting.
When there's not good fiction about any other sports.
That's interesting because the drama is much more individual. It's much more focused feeling, isn't it? That it's sort of, they're individual players, literally players in terms of it's a play and they're actually the athletes playing. But that's true. That's true. I hadn't thought of that.
Well, when you think about narrative storytelling, in terms of a lot of these baseball, the best baseball movies and books are not about people hitting the big home run, right? They're about someone running out of time. And that time is and that time isn't official. It's not on a clock. It's sort of around their growth or around their.
It's hard to.
I'll say.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephen. Sorry.
Well, I was just.
No. I'm talking. I'm rambling. Actually.
No. It's super interesting.
It's super interesting. Yeah, I like this kind of spirituality of baseball is a really cool theme. And I just to tell one quick story about how I'm a White Sox fan. And there is a weird kind of psychodynamic about following terrible teams. There's something about, you know what I mean? It heightens the way that hope springs eternal. You're also part of this club of underdogs. It's really kind of a unifying thing.
Well, it's that romance, but that's that that's like the Brits love the Robert Scott dying in Antarctica.
Right.
and nobody cares about what's it mean. Yeah.
You're supposed to be a White Sox fan if you're on the South Side, but my dad was a North Sider who became a Sox fan, and so my brothers and I are all dutifully Sox fans. But when he died a few years ago, we actually took some of his ashes to Sox Park and sprinkled them around. And I'm I didn't even think about how fucking religious that is. We were just laughing he would love this. This is really funny. But it really is become sort of a spiritual center of things for many of us.
For sure. Definitely. But I was just going to say one thing, just to go back to the thing where I was talking about the eccentricity of different people. I do think part of what's cool, just what you're talking about there, that I do think is different about baseball, and why I think in some ways there's this ability to sort of study, as much as I hear you say, who cares about the players, I do think because there is this time, there's time to actually see these guys functioning in their different ways. You're given time, you're given, and you're able to study them more. You're able to actually, they become more individual than other sports. It's in a way, they're really, really required to be individuals
1,000%.
And then function as a team. So there is a way that you can appreciate who they are a little bit more.
And they don't have all the equipment on of football. It's not
they also
helmet,
don't have all
shoulder
that stuff
pads.
on. You can see them much more. You can see their bodies much more, which I think is something that's interesting about baseball too. But all that stuff is great, Alex, about my dad, all that. I mean, I think at bottom, he was a guy who just was a game is better than life. Games are just better than life. They're where rules actually apply. They're where boundaries actually help you. They're where all of these things are actually make things better. They're better than life is really basically what I think he was always saying.
I mean, he was. It's so interesting because I love that there was sort of a romantic administrator to the game because I mentioned his name to somebody once and they went, oh yeah, the commissioner of baseball, which of course I knew and makes sense. But it's so interesting because I think of him primarily as a sort of philosopher of sport.
Yeah. Yeah. I think he was. Yeah.
It really is a fascinating it's fascinating that this guy wrote, basically a set of codices about like how to consider the game. And like you said, the odium, I can't remember what the opposite of odium is, but I know it gets brought up in Take Time for Paradise, which is this play space, this play time. But like baseball is a really good Axis Mundi. Baseball is like a really great way. And for a Jew who loves ritual that harkens back to another time, like baseball squares so many of these impossible things. Like it's urban and it's agrarian. It's individual effort and collective excellence. It's
yes, exactly.
Like, it's just like a lot going on.
There's a Chinese Taoist idea called Wu Wei, which you guys are probably familiar with. And it's translated a lot as non-action, but it's really just means like action in accordance with nature. And so the Taoists are trying to say, like, you're trying too hard. Relax and try to not try so hard, but just like you have to be loose. And a lot of the metaphors they use are like for butchers and shit. Like, how do you chop up an ox? You have to make sure the blade goes through just between the joint, not like in the middle. And baseball is a lot like that. And sport, I think, is a lot like that. So, yeah.
Sport in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, the looseness of like, I think like there's a lot in the sort of like, you have to sort of accept a lot of things are going to happen and do your best to impact it, but it's not entirely up to you. Like, I remember a friend of mine, we're watching a game and I said to them like, yes, Shohei Ohtani and Mike Trout both hit 3 homers as the Angels fell to the Tigers 16-9. Like it's like one of those things where like you have the 2 best players on the planet and they're still not like, they're not exactly nailing it collectively because
every time. Yeah.
It's not tennis. It's not basketball, right? Like, or ice hockey. Like as soon as Wayne Gretzky was introduced into the NHL, whatever team he was on was immediately a contender. As soon as Bobby Orr, same thing. Larry Bird, Magic Johnson.
That's interesting. I'd never thought of that. Yeah.
Like you get 1/9 essentially. And yet a lot of these guys reinvigorate their teams, their leaders in ways that and I think, guys, the thing that you're responding to about the individual personalities is within these limitations, anyone who seems to somehow exceed them is so clearly obvious, right? Like it's so obvious if someone can exceed their one at bat or their, one set of pitches. Like it's a really cool thing. And also, I love the game as a sort of like American religion, not to be like a little stinky patriot. Like I love the
No, I agree.
I was just thinking there's a weird little shop in my neighborhood that's sort of like this eccentric food shop that's been there for decades. And it's the same kind of weird old hippie guy who runs it. And he's been there forever and he gets weird foods in there and stuff. So I go in there every now and then. But almost every time I've ever gone in there, it's a mess. There's never anybody else in there. It's very eccentric. It's a very weird place. But every time I go in there, he's got a baseball game on the radio. And he's got like, you hear the Mets and I walk in there and that sound is so particularly American of a baseball game on the radio. There's nothing else that sounds like that. I'll walk in and they won't be talking. The announcers won't be talking, but I know a baseball game is on the radio because of that quality of silence.
That sound,
That silence that you're hearing is distinctly an American sound of baseball. Somehow you can even tell in the silences that it's this American thing. It's crazy how fucking distinctly there's nothing else that sounds like that. And it does feel religious in some weird way. And my father's whole thing was listening to the game on the radio was this kind of religious experience that you're having this internal experience of holding the whole thing in your head and holding the whole thing. And it's all in the imagination and it's all in this kind of deeply internal, contemplative kind of religious experience. It's really kind of cool.
But the poet Paul Muldoon, who is a really great Pulitzer Prize, I think twice winning poet. He was in, I was doing shows in England and I know Paul, he's like he lives near me in New York and he was teaching a class on Irish poetry or Gaelic poetry in Belfast. And he's like, why don't you come over for the day? And I was like, for sure. And we're walking around and we walked by this BBC radio building. He said, I used to work in this building. It's like, really? He said, yeah. He said, you know why people prefer radio to television? And I was like, why? And he went,
do tell.
He went, well, the pictures are better. And I was like, holy moly.
Fuck.
But, but for baseball, But for
Wow.
baseball, the pictures are more varied, right? Because like Fenway Park's picture is so different from Camden Yards is. And
Yeah,
like at
yeah,
any football
absolutely.
or basketball or hockey game, it's still play, it looks like
Looks the same.
the same 100 yards. But
Yeah.
baseball's so weird and non-standard. Like it is goofy where there are some stadiums where 406 feet is a home run by 50 feet in one direction, and then in another ballpark, and that exact same hit is an easy pop fly to shallow to mid center.
Very strange. Yeah. Yeah, but that's great. Yeah. That's great.
That's the
sort of-
regionality of it sort of peeking
Yeah.
through, I think, the American
Yeah.
regionality.
Stephen, other philosophers. Can I ask a stupid question?
Absolutely. I'm sure it won't be, but go ahead.
I'm wondering if there is anyone who tries to drill down at the sort of like quintessential interior life of what Americans have, or maybe it's so regionalist it's pointless to decipher. But I'm curious if there is a sort of national identity bent at all to philosophy.
I think, honestly, this is going to sound very old-fashioned, but I still think the best is de Tocqueville, who did it all those years ago. It's really a sensitive portrayal of the American
Democracy in America is the name of that book. Yeah.
And that de Tocqueville started this tradition, I think. But the problem is that while there are people still doing it, Paul and I, we were just talking about this guy, Henri. Who's that guy?
Henri
he's a
Levy.
French- Yeah, Henri Levy.
Bernard Henri Levy, BHL.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Yeah.
Yeah, there are people who do it, but they're so if they're European, they're very caught in a kind of jargon, and they seem like really dedicated to sounding shocking and bizarre and like interesting themselves. And as a result of it, they're not actually giving us much insight into American psyches. And you'll see like Zizek will do this too. He's a sort of a famous philosopher of the,
Slavoj Žižek. He's Serbian, right?
He's actually pretty good with things like analyzing Hollywood, and he's clever. So that they're out there, but I can't think of anybody that's like that I'm willing to recommend to you. I will think about it though, and maybe if I come up with something, I'll send it your way.
I mean, I like sports as a mirror to who we are. For like that reason, in the sense that like I'm writing a story about NASCAR for a magazine, and I don't particularly like NASCAR, or I didn't like NASCAR, and but I thought that, well, I don't like this thing, so clearly there's something there, right? Like clearly I have such a indifference to it, and it means so much to so many people. I should probably like see what's going on. And I went down there, and like it is a reflection of a sort of like they have a very utilitarian, like their view of cars is completely different from how we view cars. Like it's the same way that like people in the Midwest view land, right? Like it's not just a place you live, it's also the factory from which you make your life. And so cars are have the same sort of like dramatic potential. Like there is a really beautiful, and by the way, the other thing is sports are a parent-child activity. Like they are ultimately at their core. Like NASCAR is suffering, I think, partially because it used to be that if your car broke, your dad would pop open the hood and you'd sort of have this backyard engineering where you tinker around until you figure out what was wrong with it. But now, if your car breaks, you take the car to the dealership. They plug the car in, and the car tells you what's wrong with it.
Yeah, it's a computer. Yeah, I get a fucking report every month from my Subaru telling me how it's doing. Didn't NASCAR? That's true. Doesn't this is just a question, and then I don't know how deeply you've gotten in, but aren't the roots of NASCAR to some extent
moonshine?
Didn't it begin as moonshiners outrunning the feds and stuff like that? Is that true?
Yes, it did. It was an arms race. It was an arms race between the moonshiners and the feds. And then when Prohibition ended, people still wanted to watch whiskey cars.
Amazing.
That's great.
Run each other. But there was a sort of homebrew genius to it. And then NASCAR differs from other car races because the cars are stock cars, right? So the cars are
they're just
so
cars.
Now it's not about
I love NASCAR.
Yeah, it's like who's the best driver. Oh, it's fantastic. I'm really into it.
I've never seen NASCAR. I went to the Indy 500 once though, which I'd always wanted to see a Formula One and stuff like that. And it was pretty extraordinary. It was a pretty amazing experience.
Also, it has something baseball doesn't, which is the specter of death, which is that it's extremely dangerous.
Yes, good point.
And also, their most famous
So,
Hockey.
Hockey. It's
Boxing does too. I've always thought boxing had
boxing.
it too. Yeah, boxing had it too. What were we going to say? Sorry, Alex, what were you saying?
no. That's boxing is a perfect. Pete Hamill, who's also who's a great novelist and boxing writer, who wrote a good baseball book called Snow in August, says there are only two stories: boxer on the way up and boxer on the way down. But then he wrote a story towards the end of his life, which was, he said, but there is a third one which we forget about until it happens, which is boxer dies in the ring.
Boxer.
He goes, and that is both things. He's like, it's a very like interesting, it's a very interesting thing to happen. And in NASCAR, it happened to the biggest driver in the it would be like if a God forbid a million I'll say a retired athlete so that it can never even be manifested. But it would be like if Tom Brady, God forbid, was died on the field, and it was during the Daytona 500. It would be like if he died on the field during like in the last lap. It'd be like if he died in the last minute of the Super Bowl, and then his son had to go back there and race again for the rest of his career.
Yeah.
That's super, super Greek. It's really like...
Exactly. I was thinking about the Greeks, because like in the Olympics, if you perform beautifully, they would say, that was magnificent, now die. Because they thought that is the zenith. You've completed the arc. You should pass out of existence because the rest of your life will only be downhill. So it was like a compliment to say, die now.
Oh, really?
Yeah. During the Olympics.
I mean, like it's a terrible thing to imagine, but sport, I don't know. I feel like in all of the sort of gossip that's like sports to me sometimes now feels like Bravo Housewives. Like the NASCAR drivers that I interviewed all seemed sort of like very real world. They're like, I'm not here to make friends, and you're like, okay, well, shut up. It's like, I don't care.
That's terrible.
But like behind the personalities, there is this thing that we do, which is play. And these guys play at a level that has made them into like gods. Like talk about the Greeks, like one of the richest Greeks to ever, or one of the richest Romans to ever live was an Olympic champion who was given.
Who was that?
Oh God. The way to get it actually is to Google.
One of the richest.
If you Google highest paid athlete in history.
A Roman comes up. That's hilarious.
Really?
I like it.
The highest paid athlete in human history.
This is the first time this has happened on Chinwag, by the way, that somebody has live fact checked themselves. That's
because he's a millennial. He's the rest of us will be like, I can't think and type at the same time. He's like, no problem.
Gaius Apelles Diocles, who earned the equivalent of 15 billion before his retirement, which is a lot of money.
Does it say the dates?
15 million in ancient Rome, which would be like 3 billion now or something. I mean, who the hell knows what he would have been?
I actually don't need to check this part. He was born in like 104, and he started racing when he was 18. So that was
He was a charioteer.
Yes, he was a charioteer.
Because I was going to say, any other athlete, they would die. I mean, it was like the athletes died. I mean, you'd get killed in the ring or something. But the charioteering thing was fucking bananas then. I mean, it was like, people would become devoted. There were political factions. I mean, you had the blues and the greens. That's about as inventive as they got. I don't know if they had other colored teams, but they were the two principal teams. And there were riots. I mean, and there were they became deeply sort of politicized and people
what do you think about that? That you could argue that a lot of the sports that we're talking about are ways in which cruelty got slowly pushed down, and you got like a kind of mock or like surrogate warfare. Like you got to, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to express that exactly, but
I mean, George Carlin has a bit about that. George Carlin had a joke about comparing baseball and football.
That's true.
He's like baseball's so like soft and in his tone of voice. He's like baseball, you wear a cap. Football, you wear a helmet.
Yes. And it's all
baseball,
like,
you go home.
Yeah, right. And in football, you go out for the bomb and stuff like that.
Yeah.
In New Guinea, there's the culture where they literally, the warfare has become there's a sort of ritualized game,
like sport
that they play between, that they play between people. I mean,
what is bullfighting other than that?
And you've seen it, right, Paul? You've seen some bullfighting.
I've seen a bullfight. Yes, I probably shouldn't be admitting this and be on the podcast,
Edit
but
this
I have
out.
seen a bullfight. Yeah. Well, no, I mean,
I'm curious, what was it? By the way, don't fault you at all for seeing a bullfight, but I mean, if you were like, it was the best thing I've ever seen, I go back every
people
Tuesday.
would.
I'd be like,
well, no. Paul, steady, lad. It was pretty wild. I mean, it was really wild, and I saw it in Barcelona, where it was not even a big deal, and I think they don't do it at all there anymore. And apparently, again, it's very political. I think with conservative governments, when there's a conservative government in Spain, the bullfighting's on the rise. When there's a liberal government, it gets shelved and stuff. So it's a nationalistic. It's got this deep nationalistic thing, and it's deeply, for certain Spaniards, it's the most Spanish thing you could do is fight a bull. I mean, the depth of like what's being drawn upon in a bullfight is because, again, the specter of death. I mean, I saw a guy get partially gored. He got gored in the leg.
Whoa.
And it was like, which I don't know how often it happens, but I did see a guy get gored, and he was okay.
probably more than it does in New York City, right? Probably,
Yes.
probably more than it does in
Yes.
New York.
Well, I don't know about New York these days, but it's like, but for sure, it was definitely, it was intense. And
Did you feel like pumped up on the bloodlust, or were you feeling empathy? You got to be careful with your response
Did
here.
Paul Giamatti feel pumped up on the bloodlust?
yeah, pumped on the bloodlust. No, I think I was kind of, no, it was appalling. But I think I was amazed by the connection between the guy and the animal was kind of fascinating. When it really becomes, when it gets into the moment where they're like, they begin sort of this crazy dance together, there's something kind of remarkable and beautiful about the man and the animal sort of joining in that way is kind of remarkable. And the sense of how old this must be, the sense of sacrifice, and then the kind of, what we would now, but the idea that there's this kind of homage being paid to the bull, that it's this kind of respect. The idea is that there's this kind of ancient sense of respect in killing the bull, that you're sort of, that it's a sacrifice and things like that. You can see all that stuff in it, but, obviously our brains are different and we don't interpret it.
Right.
At least I don't. But, or probably a lot of Spaniards don't anymore remember all that stuff. But you can feel that ancient thing of like, at one time, guys would jump over the bull and stuff, and all that crazy stuff the Minoans would do and all that stuff. You can feel it. But I was not pumped up on the bloodlust. I want to make that clear. I want to make that abundantly clear.
Pumped up on the bloodlust is one of my favorite Warren Zevon albums, actually. I love Pumped Up on the Bloodlust.
It might be my memoir title, though, Pumped Up on the Bloodlust. I will tell you a crazy event that I saw, and then we've taken up a lot of your time, but I will tell you one crazy event that I saw.
This is the best. I have to say that this is delightful, and I feel like there are...
Okay, good. Well, it is. It
For
is
us
delightful.
too, yeah.
The idea, by the way, I was in a sports bar in the Everglades, not to brag, a couple of years ago, and I was watching the game, and this guy, and like, I look up and everyone in the bar is looking at me, and I was like, oh shit. Like, I'm clearly not a guy who belongs here. And one guy was like, hey, you a Sox fan? Because I am a Sox fan. I went, yeah. And then thinking this would endear me, I went, yeah. And I'm from there, but even if I wasn't, I think the sort of Sisyphean nature of how... And then I just watched everyone in the bar just sort of like turn away, like not even interested anymore. Yeah, just sort of.
Sisyphus.
Well, it probably both put you in danger and drove the danger away at the same time.
Oh no, he's tiresome. He's tiresome. Please.
What the fuck is he talking about? The craziest sporting thing I saw that actually in a way was almost more disturbing than a bullfight was I saw the Palio, which is this legendary horse race in Siena.
Yeah.
Which is where they race
nuts.
in the center of Siena. And that is crazy because
so dangerous.
Each district of the city has a horse in the game. And it's this ancient thing that goes back to, so each one of them has this kind of deep investment in their horse.
I've heard about this.
The horses get blessed in the church the night before, and they walk the horses up into the church. And it's this crazy dangerous race around with these sharp turns, and there's people standing in the middle of it.
They're in the middle. It's
I
crazy.
watched it from a balcony from somebody I knew at a place there. So we watched it from a balcony. But there's this incredible, very Italian thing at the beginning of it, is that they corral the horses in this area to take off, but there's no order to it. And one guy will hang back and wait and wait and wait to finally enter the pen, and they'll all take off. But it's this incredibly Italian thing. If you don't know when the guy's going to come in, you don't know when he's going to decide to bring his horse in, and you can all take off. So the horses are going crazy, and it's mayhem in this sort of pen where the horses are until this one fucking guy decides, I'll go in, and then you can take off. That was way more bananas, actually, in a way, than a bullfight. And it was harrowing. Anyway. That's just my story about that. And horse racing's a whole other fucked up thing.
Yeah, that's something I would like to talk about. We'll have to have you come back and because I want to talk about animals in sport, because it really is a different thing, you know. It's a fascinating issue.
It's totally different, and also it's so funny. It never feels like sports to me, because to me sports is like ultimately what it comes down to is human beings playing and trying to reach a higher thing, right? They're trying to get at a higher thing, and whether that thing is enjoyment or whether that thing is like, you know, again, misquoting your dad, but Bart Giamatti was very big into the idea, oh God, as an authority on Bart Giamatti.
No, you know it. Sadly, you know it way better than I do, which is great. I'm glad you do.
But he was big on this idea that at its center, play is not for commercial gain, which I think made him such an excellent steward of baseball, which is because he was able to see past all of the sort of temporal financial stuff.
Yeah.
And by the way, baseball as a business is really interesting in that it's run as a socialist collective. It's like in the sense that the owners have to sign off on every new owner. And it's like,
I didn't know
that. And like the commissioner has to, the people that bought the Red Sox that were my bosses were not the people that bid the most on the team. They were the people that promised to keep Fenway Park up. And Commissioner Seelig thought that was going to be the most interesting way for the Red Sox to be run. And so he took a gamble, and then the Red Sox won all these championships, and it's like, it really paid off. But there's revenue sharing, which is pretty socialist in baseball. There's a salary cap with a luxury tax. That's like there's still a lack of parity in a huge way between teams that are the haves and the have-nots. But there are also like, it has introduced, like the White Sox, Stephen, that you grew up suffering through, have won a couple of championships in your adulthood.
Yes, they have. They have. Yeah, I was at one of them. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, it was amazing, actually. Yeah.
That feeling.
It was incredible.
I bet it was.
I couldn't, my voice was completely gone the whole next 2 days. And I didn't even realize we're just screaming so hard. It's nuts.
It just means something. It's like, gosh.
Oh, I had one of those tragic stories where my mother died before the Red Sox finally won. And she was a big Red Sox. I mean, my family was all like you, big Red Sox fans. But there were so many stories of that. But my mother passed a year of it. She died, a month before they won. And it just was like,
My grandmother was the biggest Red Sox fan, thought it was so fun. My parents do not care for sports. So it was funny to them that I got a job as a kid. They were like, I brought my dad once to a ball game. He'll hate that I'm telling this, but it's okay. I brought my dad once to a ball game because I'd get these great seats when I was like 15 years old. And, Red Sox tickets in 2003 and 4 or 2005 to that, like you could not get them. They were so expensive. They were so hard to get. And I got tickets as an employee. I brought my dad once, and he shows up, and I stopped by the seats because I was working that day. It was a weekend. It was a Sunday day game. And he brought Hunt for the Red October with him, the Tom Clancy novel. And so I go up into the media box because I was working in PR by then. And Joe Castiglione is one of the Red Sox announcers. I'm in the media box and I hear Joe Castiglione go, "You will not believe this, but there is a guy about 10 rows back in the grandstand. And he's right on camera here.
and
he is reading." And then someone else went, "What was that, Joe? A Tom Clancy novel?" "Yeah, it's a Tom Clancy novel. You can tell from the typeface." And so I did have a cell phone then, run down to my dad, be like, "Dad, stop reading." And he's like, "What?"
That's very funny.
It's boring.
That's
boring.
Very funny. Very funny.
Hey, to salvage your dad's reputation, I did notice that in one of your specials that he is a heart surgeon and almost won the Nobel Prize. So
yes,
a big
so
props to your dad.
It's fine that he's sitting there. Yeah, anybody can do that. Anybody can claim that.
Well, this has been really awesome, man.
This is the most fun. Thank you guys
so much.
It was
awesome.
Much.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Alex.
You so much, Alex.
Please.
Thanks,
Appreciate
man.
it.
Thank you.
Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films. Hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma. Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein. Original theme music by Luke Topp, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Audio production supervision by Matt Dyson. Editing and mixing by Jeff Neal. Animation created by Alex Sokol. Research assistance by Aidan Brooks. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.